Joining us now, correspondent, Washington Post, Rachel Weiner. Rachel, great to have you with us.
Hi, great to be here.
First of all, happy Valentine's Day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you. I've been married a very long time, bought the flowers, got that going.
Excellent.
So I got my bases covered. But same with the cat. He eats the flowers, so I had to put them up. I leave early before Ann gets up. I have to put them up on top of the refrigerator. I have to hide them from the cat. It's like ridiculous. Anyway, we're not going to talk about that.
Yes.
Your story in the Post, just fascinating. Can you just share with our listeners the corruption convictions at the Baltimore PD? Rachel, they're breathtaking.
Sure. So two officers were convicted on Monday, but those were only the two that went to trial. 6 officers, former officers now, pled guilty, including 2 sergeants, one of whom was really considered, a golden boy, as they said at trial, in the department and lauded for running this gun unit, where it turned out that what he was mostly doing was stealing kilos of drugs, heroin, cocaine, pounds of marijuana, and selling them through a bail bondsman who's also been convicted, also pled guilty. Even sometimes stealing guns and selling those, just taking cash from people, hundreds of thousands of dollars from suspected drug dealers. And the 2 who were convicted this week were a part of that. They weren't the leaders, which I think is why they went to trial, thinking they were not as culpable, but they were definitely involved, and they were taking cash from people that they didn't think would complain because they were criminals or suspected criminals. They had records, so, if it was their word against a police officer, most people would trust a police officer, but then you look at what came out in court, and it's hard to imagine people trusting Baltimore police generally.
Oh, my goodness. I mean, what you had in the story was unbelievable. Things like, well, let's get to just the overtime, right?
Oh, yes. They were also, while they were
God.
robbing people, they were also just constantly filing for overtime when they sometimes weren't even in the country. One of the guys who went to trial was in the Dominican Republic for a week when he filed for, something like 15 hours a day of work. And they showed his plane records. And the other guy who went to trial apparently took a month off to work on his house and filed for regular time and overtime that whole month. It was just totally shameless. And it's been a huge problem in Baltimore for years. They've got this huge overtime budget, and they haven't known how to deal with it. And now this shows that a lot of that overtime is probably not, it's not because they do have staffing issues in the police department, but a lot of it is just people filing for it when they're, at a bar, at home, asleep. And testimony came out that, it was not just this unit, that overtime fraud is really pervasive through the department. Sometimes it's a reward, they said, for doing good work, but in other cases, it's just, people do it because they can.
Well, look, it's being abused. And, you look at the people that were on trial filing for the overtime. I mean, they're shaking down drug dealers and criminals and robbing them and going in their home and just taking their cash and not reporting it, putting it in their pockets. And then they have to turn around and scam the city for overtime. I mean, it's the greed and corruption is unbelievable. And so you're telling stories where this police in this particular unit would basically go after drug dealers, chase them down, and instead of arresting them, rob them, go into their home, and they wanted to know where the safe was, where the cash was. I mean, the alternative is you get brought in or you give them the cash. And, you were chronicling instances of them getting, $15,000, $20,000 a pop and splitting it up. And also explain to our audience how the feds got their surveillance on them.
Oh, sure. So the way this all got uncovered was the DEA had a wiretap on a major drug dealer in Baltimore, and then they heard the voice of a Baltimore police officer who was working with this drug dealer. And so they referred that to the FBI. The FBI put a tap on both of that officer's phones, and they put a bug in his car, and that's how they discovered that this went way beyond this one police officer. That was Momodu Gondo, who testified at trial. He also testified at the trial of the two drug dealers that he was working with. He and another detective went beyond stealing on the job to robbing people's houses after work outside of their uniforms with drug dealers that they knew. So part of a heroin ring, really. So that's how that came to light. And there was another instance where they were almost caught by a DEA agent because they had followed a drug dealer all the way from Baltimore to Prince George's County, hoping to knock him over the head with a hammer and rob him, and they were only intercepted because a DEA agent was following the same drug dealer for a legitimate investigation. So they almost got caught then, but it was this wiretap that got them. And the wiretap had them, talking about lying about their overtime, talking about covering up a car crash, talking about taxing drug dealers is what they would call it, if they would take their money and not charge them with anything. So it was really insane.
So they believed that for the drug dealers, that was just a cost of doing business, and they figured that criminals wouldn't turn them in, right? Because, then they have to admit of wrongdoing.
Right, so exactly. And the four ex-cops who testified said that, basically, who's going to complain if we take drugs and we submit some of the drugs to the police, but we keep some and we keep some of the money, if they complain, then they're admitting that it was theirs, so they're not going to complain. And for the most part, that was true. There was one guy who did write a letter to Internal Affairs and wrote a letter to the FBI saying some of his money was stolen, but no one responded to him until after the indictments, and he ended up testifying. But of course, he also said they stole a kilo of heroin from him, and he never mentioned that at the time because he was facing drug charges, and who would complain about, like he said on the stand, I was going to trial for selling drugs. Why would I tell you I had more drugs? So that, that's how they got away with it.
The scam,
years.
the depth of this was unbelievable. And by the way, we're with Rachel Weiner. She's with the Washington Post. She did a piece on the corruption and conviction trial of several members of the Baltimore police. You can read that. Go to WashingtonPost.com. Just put her name in there, Rachel Weiner, and you'll find it. Story came out on Monday. Rachel, also, what was shocking to me is IAB was involved in this potentially, right? In a cover-up.
Potentially in the overtime fraud, yes. There was testimony. This was not proven in court, but there was testimony that the now head of Internal Affairs, or until this trial, head of Internal Affairs, had been giving out overtime as rewards for getting guns and drugs off the street. And so that came out at trial. That was an issue, although he denied that, I believe. And then there was also testimony that a deputy commissioner helped cover up a fatal shooting and coached officers on how to make it look good in 2009. He also denied that, but he retired as soon as that testimony came out. So there's definitely, the investigation is ongoing, and the FBI has said they're still looking. There's chances that there could be new charges. There was also testimony that someone in the state's attorney's office, this was a federal case, but in the city prosecutor's office, tipped off the officers to the fact that they were under investigation, and no one's been charged in the prosecutor's office, so that could also come out.
Well, let's talk about that, Rachel Weiner, because that's pretty bad. Now you're talking about, somebody in the DA's office that was part of the scam, right? Tipping the officers off that saying that investigation was coming. Now you go from beyond the Baltimore Police Department and rank-and-file cops trying to make money, steal money. Now you get to the DA's office.
It's really suggests that it's a pervasive problem. The police and the mayor have tried to sort of downplay it, say it was a few bad apples, but from all that testimony, it suggests that there's a lot more going on. They have started both a internal corruption investigation in the police and internal overtime fraud investigation. I think the mayor has had her own overtime fraud panel going since the indictments happened, but it's really not clear what's going to come out of that and how deep this investigation will go, and all the evidence suggests that it really needs to be thorough because it goes, especially the overtime fraud, goes way beyond these officers.
Well, what's amazing about this kind of a story is, and just so that everybody knows, the police chief and the police serve at the pleasure of the city council and the mayor, right? These are not elected positions, not like a sheriff in a county that's get elected. I mean, they're selected by the mayor and the city council, and they serve at their pleasure. And so that's the way it works. So for the mayor, there's always the mayor of any city when this happens. The instinct politically, right, is to, back the cops and try to excuse it away and say it's a few bad apples. But I read your story several times, and I mean, there's no way to draw any other conclusion that this is pervasive and widespread and a culture within the Baltimore Police Department that should be shocking to people. Now, tell the story about the clean cop, the younger officer that comes out of the academy, and they try to corrupt him, and his response. Can you share that?
So,
that's great.
That was James Kostopoulos. He was 26 when he was put on the gun trace task force, and he testified that, early on, maybe a month in, Wayne Jenkins, the sergeant at the time, and Detective Herschel, one of the guys who went to trial, told him to leave his phone in his car because they thought they might be, because they knew at that point that they might be under investigation, takes him down an alley, says, "What do you think about robbing drug dealers?" And what I did not put in my article, because it's a family newspaper, his first reaction was, "That's an effing terrible idea." And then he said, "That's what separates us from the criminals. You can't have a badge and do that." So that was sort of a ray of light in the trial that, there are people who join the Baltimore police for the right reasons and aren't willing to just go along with criminal activity. He didn't say anything at the time because he thought he was being tested. He thought that was some sort of, they were feeling him out to see if he was on the take. But then once the indictments came out, and he was quickly transferred from the unit after that because I guess they thought he was, not their kind of cop. And once the indictments came out, he realized that it wasn't a test, that actually they were telling him that they committed crimes and they wanted him to join in. So then he contacted the FBI.
So then he contacted the FBI, but this was after they got him out of there, right? They got him out of their unit, right? Yeah. The sergeant and the detective got him out of the unit because he wouldn't play ball with them. And you said in your article that the young fella at first didn't go to anybody because he thought they were testing him,
right? Like
to see if he was corrupt. Like he thought they were the good guys.
Right.
Then he found out when they were the bad guys. Then he went to the FBI and said, well, let me tell you what they suggested me in an alleyway. Right. And here's exactly what happened. Rachel, how did the FBI get the surveillances? Like you said, they tapped their phones. They got a device in their phones. They had a device in their car, their houses. How did they get all the surveillance done?
I mean, through, the same way they're allowed to on other people without telling them they're under investigation. Just because they're police officers doesn't change that. And, if not for the fact that other people leaked to them that there was an investigation, they wouldn't have known. Of course, even though they did know there was an investigation, they still were fairly brazen in what they were doing even after. But
the DA's office tipped them off that they were having an investigation, but the money was just flowing in, and they were brazen.
They really kept going, so they, I think, just had not gotten caught for so long. I mean, the indictment only goes back to 2014, but there was testimony that they were all engaging in this behavior back to at least 2008. So I think they really felt untouchable at that point, even though they knew there was an investigation. And I think they thought the investigation was focused on the one cop who had been wiretapped, Gondo, and they didn't realize that they were all being watched.
They were all being watched. Unbelievable. So they've all been convicted.
Yep.
So when is the sentencing date, Rachel?
They have not scheduled sentencing yet. So it'll be interesting to see because, six pled guilty, 4 of them cooperated, and that, they said in court that honestly they're cooperating in hopes of getting lower sentences. They're already in prison. But these two went to trial, that will probably mean harsher sentences. The two sergeants, interesting, the two people who led the unit were the two who pled guilty but refused to cooperate, refused to testify or work with prosecutors. So they'll likely get larger sentences. I believe Wayne Jenkins, who is really kind of the big guy behind all of this, his plea agreement says that he will get at least 20, but no more than 30 years in prison. So that will probably be the longest sentence, somewhere between 20 and 30 years.
A lot of time behind bars. And is the Justice Department now involved in trying to weed this out? Are they involved in monitoring this? How is the U.S. Department of Justice involved in this?
Well, it's ongoing. They said they're still investigating, and they are working with a unit within the Baltimore police, which they emphasized has been incredibly helpful throughout this whole process. So not everyone in the Baltimore police is bad there. They have been working with people there in internal affairs who helped uncover all of this and helped with the prosecution. And there were members of that unit in court every day taking note of the names that came out in testimony to follow up. So they won't say where it's leading. They say we'll know if there are indictments, but they're continuing to investigate. And of course, the city is also separately under a civil federal consent decree that the Justice Department initiated in 2016. Of course, that whole 14-month investigation was going on while all of this was happening and somehow did not pick up on any of it, even though it said that, there were lots of problems in the Baltimore police, that they didn't understand the law, that they arrested people without probable cause. They missed this even more egregious conduct. So it's unclear how effective the consent decree will be in reining in this kind of behavior.
Well, we're going to be following this, Rachel, and have you back on. Thank you for your time. Fabulous story. Rachel, Washington Post. Go to WashingtonPost.com, and you get the story on the Baltimore police. It is a must-read. Rachel, we'll have you back. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
And great story you did. Absolutely fantastic. Excellent work. John Fredericks Radio Network, Trucking the Truth. We'll be right back.